G'day everyone, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this week's tutorial is on the very basics of Flash. What I'm going to be doing this lesson is looking at the user interface of Adobe Flash and just kind of going through the very basics of using the program itself. I know when I started the tutorial series I said it was aimed at people who are familiar with Flash, but there have been lots of requests to do this, so we might as well go back and take some baby steps. If you're viewing this in the YouTube video viewer thingy, click the annotations or click the areas around the text on the screen at the moment so you can go check out anything in particular that you might be interested. Otherwise, we're just going to get straight into it and go through each of them one by one. So first things first, the panels system. Now I'm using Adobe Flash CS6. But most versions of Flash are relatively the same. And when I say panels, I mean each of these things around the user interface that make up your experience. So this is the timeline panel, and if I click that and drag that out there, I can remove it and place it back in there. Or I could move it down and hook it up to the bottom there. Some people animate with the timeline on the bottom. And while it's not conventional, you can even put it on the side. I know an environment artist, a friend of mine, uses it on the side because he likes having more layers rather than more frames. And that works with most things. Like we have colors and swatches here. We've pulled them both out. I can do things like join them together and have them in different tabs like that, or completely separate them and have one on this side. So you can completely customize your experience. Now, if we go up here to Window and then scroll down to Workspace, there are a whole bunch of default workspaces that you can use. Now, I've made one called JAZZA'S workspace. I've set it up the way I like it, and then I've saved the workspace. So if I go to click Animator, this is Flash's default animator workspace, which confuses the hell out of me. And there are a whole bunch of really weird different workspaces. There's Classic, which is one of the old school sort of setups. There's Debug, which is much more for coders. Where are we? Workspace. There's Developer. So as you can see, it's pretty customizable. Now, if I wanted to make some changes, so let's say I'm a developer, I like this workspace, I might move the properties panel over here so I can have this area free, and I might look at this and say, hey, this is great, I want to use this as my default workspace. Well, if that's the case, you can go down to Workspace, go Manage Workspaces. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Go to New Workspace, and then you save it and say Designer 2. And if I click OK, now when I go to Workspace, Designer 2 is one of these default custom workspaces up there. Now I'm going to just delete it because I have no use for it. And return, oh, there you go, it already did that for me. It's returned to JAZZA'S workspace. So this is my workspace. And I'm going to go through each of the panels one by one, and you can see what they do individually. So first things first, the Tools panel. Now over here on the left, this is what comprises the Tools panel. Some people can set it up in different ways. Some people might have it stretched out where the tools are kind of laid in different groups like that, but all the basic tools are there, and it all does the same thing. If you use earlier version of Flash, that's okay. It'll still use most of the same tools. So I'm going to go through them one by one. To start off with, I'm going to need something to manipulate. So I'm going to draw a nice, badly drawn smiley face. And just for good measure, we'll make it a Watchmen reference. There we go. So there you go, that's our smiley face. And you will see why I made that later when I go through this panel and show you the tools. So the first tool here, we have the selection tool, and if you hover over it, it shows the shortcut, which happens to be V. Now, with that selected, I simply select an area. I can click and drag and use that. That is everything you need to know about the selection tool. Oops, sorry. I need to... I have all the keyboard shortcuts that I use habitually ingrained in my fingers, so I've been skipping between tools, but I need to stop doing that because I'm showing you the tools. Okay, number 2, we have the sub-selection tool. Now, if I click an area that I want to sub-select, you'll see these weird little boxes appear around it. They are the actual vertices or nodes of the vector image. So if you grab one of them and pull them out, you're individually moving those vector points. So if you have a really overcomplicated, detailed picture, if I scribble really quickly over here, and if I sub-select that, you'll see all those dots everywhere. And if I want to simplify it, I can just select some of those individual dots and delete them to simplify it, or delete the whole thing. Anyways, okay, so next on the tool is the free transform tool. Now this is the one I keep habitually pressing. The shortcut to is Q, and you can see that this is the one for shaping, resizing, rotating, things like that. If I wanted to rotate and keep all the proportions accurate, I hold Shift while I do so, and that keeps the proportions the way that I had them. If I don't have Shift selected, I can do things like that, but I won't be doing that. So that is the free transform tool. Next we have the gradient transform tool. Now to demonstrate this, I will put in a simple gradient where I put that blood area. I'll go through gradients later, but for now I just want to show you the gradient transform tool. So when I select this tool and click on an area that has a gradient, it didn't work very well. Hang on a second. Okay. With the gradient transform tool, you can see that that point in the middle is where I clicked to paste the gradient, and it gradients out from there. So I can manipulate the gradient. I can pull it thin or wide. I can expand it to be larger or smaller. I can move it from the middle. And that lets me control the basic setup of how that individual gradient is. So that's the gradient transform tool. Now these are 3D rotation and translation tool things. I've never used them. I'm not going to go through them. If you figure it out, good for you. Next is the lasso tool. This is pretty simple. If I just wanted to cut off the top half of his head, I could just go like that. Or I could use the selection tool, which is V, or the free transform tool, which is Q, and just select it. But the lasso tool, which is L, allows me to be much more manipulative and tricky with what I select and move, things like that. Next we have the pen tool. If I click with the pen tool activated and drag, I'm able to place much more calculated line setups. Oops. I did place it, but I had the wrong color selected, so I'm not being very useful today. If I make it black, that'll work. Okay, so that was the line I just made. I'll select the whole thing. So I made this weird border with the line tool just now. I rarely use the line tool. I think it would be used for much more calculated graphic design sort of things. Moving along, there are other tools to do with the pen tool, but I won't go through them because I don't use them at all. Okay, next we have text. That's pretty simple. You can click and drag to select a width setup, and that is how the text tool works. If I wanted to move that over here, I can double click in there to activate the text area and click and drag that little square in the corner to change how wide I'm letting it be. And the properties panel, which we'll go through later, allows you to change properties of the text that you place. Next is the line tool, shortcut N. So as with the other line sort of tools, it's fairly straightforward. You don't really need more information on that. I will give a few little pointers. If you have V or Q selected, which are transform or selection tools, and you want to manipulate the lines, then you can simply click on the edge where you see that point to move that one line. You can click in the middle to bend it, or to break it in half, you hold Control. So if I wanted to make this a bit of a zigzag, I could hold Control and click in the middle and keep just going like that. And it breaks it up. And then I could bend it and make it twirly-whirly. You get the idea. So that's the line tool. We don't need to go through that anymore. Next is the shape tool. This is pretty straightforward as well. More properties to these are in the properties panel, which again we'll go through later. But it's pretty straightforward. You make shapes. You click and drag and you make shapes. Hooray! Next is the pencil tool. Yay! So this is the same setup as the line tool, the shape tool, the pen tool, but it's much more aimed to be like the brush tool, where it's about exactly following your brush stroke. Now, it's a much more calculated line. The width and thickness of the line is always exactly the same, which you can always change in the properties. Now, if you wanted to convert this to a brush or a fill sort of setting, you can go Modify, Shape, Convert Lines to Fills. Now, after doing that, I can do things like change the thickness of areas and mess around with that. So that's a little bit of nifty information for you. Moving along, the brush tool. Now this is something I use all the time. I animate with a brush. I draw in Flash with a brush. And it's pretty straightforward. You don't really need much more detail in using it other than that you put your pen down, or if you're using a mouse, you put your mouse down and you draw. Now there are a few settings to this. In the properties panel, which is over here, which we can go through later, there are things like smoothing and stroke and all that stuff. But I get asked quite a lot, what is my default smoothing setting on the brush? I use the default, which is 50. I use 50 as the default brush smoothness. Over here, there are a few subsection areas that you will want to know about when using the brush tool. I'm going to just move this across over here so I have a little more room to work with. So with the brush tool selected, which is shortcut B, here is the object drawing button. I rarely use this, but it enables people to, when they draw a line, to make... Oh, it didn't work. Why are you not working? It's not working. There you go. That's why I don't use it, because it doesn't even bloody work. Anyways, next, lock fill. I don't really use that very much. I use more of these. So brush mode. So the default is paint normal. If I was to take a blue squiggle and a red squiggle, paint normal paints the most recent brushed stroke over the last one. Now if I was to go paint fills, I might have to select this, and then wherever I squiggle, oh no, wrong one. Paint fills, sorry, paints under line work. So if I had lines around this squiggle, then I got my brush and changed this to paint fills, then I did my red squiggle, it paints it under the lines but over my brushwork. I rarely use that. I use this one a lot. This is paint behind. So that is paint behind. It's as simple as whatever you brushstroke draw, it appears behind what is already there. Now, that's really useful for coloring things in. It means that you can draw line-to-line areas and not worry about drawing over the line that you've drawn and color it in. Now, the paint selection area, which is the next one on the list, means that if I select an area, let's say this yellow of the face, and change my brush color to a green, whatever I paint, if I scribble there, will only appear in the area that I've selected. So that can be useful too. And then finally in this area is paint inside, and I don't really use this, so I think that's where you first start the brush stroke. So if I start the brush stroke in this red and then scribble, it'll only appear there. So if I start the brush stroke in the black and then go like that. It'll only appear in black. So that one's pretty good. That saves having to select the area that you're actually brushing in. And finally, we have the actual brush settings. So if I go over here, we've got the brush size. So I can change the brush size to something much bigger. I can change the brush angle or shape. So if I wanted to do calligraphy, I could do that. But I'll keep that on default circle. Over here we have use pressure. This is for tablets only. So if I have that deselected, it only uses that same size. But with it selected, I can all of a sudden, with that same brush size setting, do much more size differences and variations with my brush stroke. Moving on, I'll move this guy over here again. We have the spray brush tool, which I don't use at all. We have the deco tool, which I also don't use at all. We have the bone tool. Now, I don't use this at all, but I will give a very, very, very quick, rough overview as to what this does. I might as well just use my smiley face, even though it won't be a pretty result. The bone tool only works on a flat image. It doesn't work on symbols or anything like that. It has to be just the image itself, and which is probably the reason I don't like it so much. I probably would use it if it were if you could attach it to symbols and movie clips, but I'm not sure if you can do that, so I just don't worry about it. Anyways, I'm using a ActionScript 2 version of Flash, so I can't demonstrate that. Next is the paint bucket tool. This is pretty simple. This is, you select an area or a color, and you can fill it in with a paint bucket. This here is the lock fill. Now this is very useful when using gradients. So if I wanted to use the eyedropper, which was next on our list anyway, shortcut I, and select this gradient of the blood, it automatically puts on lock fill. But if I take off lock fill and then paint there, you can see that the gradients don't align. But with the eyedropper, when I select that and I keep lock fill on, then I paint it, you can see that the gradients from where I selected perfectly match up. So keep that in mind. Eyedropper, as I've just demonstrated. Then we have eraser, which is pretty straightforward. This has different brush settings as well. So same as the actual brush, this has erase fills, which means it won't erase lines when you do your erasing. We have erase lines, which exact opposite. Erases lines but not fills. Then we have erase selected fills or erase inside. So same setting where, like, if I start the brush stroke inside here, it'll only erase things inside that. Next we have the hand tool. This is useful when you're zoomed in. The hand tool is to move your project around. I rarely use it, to be honest. Then we have zoom, and that's pretty straightforward as well. Last but definitely not least, we have these basic color settings over here. We have the top one, which is selecting the line color. So if I select purple, if I use the line tool, it'll be purple. If I use the pencil tool, it'll be purple. Lines and fills are totally separate, and this is where you separate them. So if I draw a box over here, you can see the outside is purple, like I have selected here, but the inside, the fill, is the gradient. So I can change that gradient to a green. I can swap them using this button here, swap colors, or I can default to black and white by clicking that. Cool. So that is the basic overview of the tools panel. Next we have the timeline panel. Now I'm not going to go through the animation process. I will do that sometime in the future on another tutorial. I'm purely going through the user interface and the things that these things do. So if I go over here, we have the basic timeline setup, which is pretty straightforward, which is where you have a frames per second sort of view of where the frames are. But over here on the left are some basic things that you can edit that do a lot of helpful things. If I was to copy this smiley face and put him on the layer above, then we have two layers. So the bottom layer, which is over here, and the layer above, which is over here. If I select this box here, which is the show all layers as outlines, if I select that, it just simply the same color as that box, which is purple, shows it as an outline, and I can flip between that. That's very useful, trust me. Then we have lock layer. So if I lock that and then select this, it only selects that second layer, which is unlocked. Third is the invisible one. So that's pretty straightforward as well. I can hide layers. Then if we can double click on the name of the layer and rename it, which I have no use for at the moment. Over here we have the new layer button, so I can click that to add a new layer. We have the new folder button. I can click that, make a new folder, and drag these into that folder. And then I can hide that folder. So that's pretty straightforward. And then even simpler is the delete. Get rid of that folder. Then we have these settings down here. Now this is where things get a little bit more to do with the animation, and I won't go through additional detail. I'll do this in an animation tutorial in the future sometime. But this is some basic frame controls, so playing, step back, step forward, scenes, and all that stuff. This is a loop selection. Now this is only available from CS5 or 5.5 and above, I believe. And then these are some pretty simple tools here that I use for animation, and I'll go through them in another tutorial, but you can mess around with them. They're basic onion skinning where you can see frames before and after, or edit several frames at a time. That, my friends, is the timeline area. Next on our list, we have the library. So I have mine stashed away, over here on the left. As you can see in the panels, I can shrink and maximize them here. And this is my library. So what I can do with my library is, if I have this smiley face, I can press F8, or if you want to go the slow way, I haven't even done this in ages. I think it's edit? No. New symbol, is that it? Insert new symbol. Yeah, so that's it. But I use the shortcut, which is F8. So when I press F8, it brings up this. Don't worry about the advanced stuff. I can just name this symbol happy. Oops, I can't even spell happy right. Cool. So that is my symbol name. The registration point is simply where the anchor point or the middle of the movie clip is. I can change this to movie clip, button, or graphic. I can go through those in more detail in an animation tutorial, but basically a movie clip is a self-contained sort of movie. It doesn't play on the main timeline, but it does in the actual video, so that can get a bit confusing. But movie clips and buttons are the only things you can apply filter effects to. Graphics are pretty straightforward. They're graphics, but when you animate inside the graphic symbol, so if I make a happy a graphic and then double click on the happy face, it's got its own timeline here because it's its own little symbol. And I can make several frames of happy face, and I can move each one. And you can see that that's a really weird, jittery sort of animation. But if I go to the main timeline and play that, it loops. Anyways, I don't need to go through more detail in animating this stuff because this isn't an animation tutorial, so we will continue. So that is how to create the symbol. Now that I've created that graphic, you can see he appears here in the timeline. Everything that you import and use as an asset in Flash will appear in that library. Things like sounds, images or bitmaps, movie clips, buttons and graphics, all that main stuff that you will constantly be able to go back to and put into the animation, tweens, all that stuff. They all appear in here, and it's very important if you're doing bigger projects to keep it organized by using folders and naming those folders, naming symbols properly so that they show in order and are easy to find. So that's they're the basics of the library. Over here on the left as well, I have above my library my properties panel. Now this changes with whatever you have selected. You can see that with nothing selected, it has the properties of the Flash document itself. So I can change the Flash player that I'm targeting, the version of script I'm using, which is ActionScript 2 at the moment. Over here I can change the frame rate, which is currently 30 frames per second. I can change the size of the actual document. At the moment it's 640 by 360, or I can change the stage color. So that's pretty basic stuff, but that's very important to know. If I select this, however, all of that changes. So I can change the properties of this to a movie clip. And with that movie clip now, I can go down and add some filters. I can blur it, or undo that. I could adjust the color and change the hue and saturation. So you get the basic idea. So the properties panel is something that you constantly refer back to with most tools. So if I have brush selected, I have the brush settings that are constantly different. If I have a shape like a poly star tool, I can change what type of shape it is that I'm drawing. The line tool, the paint bucket, everything has editable things in the properties panel. So it's very important to keep the properties panel in a very easily accessible place. I have mine right there on the left, always ready to be used. So that is the properties panel and the library panel. Next on our list is the color and swatches area. So I'll go through color first. Color is fairly straightforward. This is used for both line and fill color. So if I select my brush tool and draw a happy face, but I want to change that, I can press K, which is the paint bucket shortcut, and I can select a color. At the moment it's in the red part, so I can move this to the green part, remove saturation, add darkness, all that stuff, and then paint it. And getting used to using various forms of these color selectors can be tricky. There are different actual ways you can set it up. I have mine set up on this one, but as you can see here, I can in CS6 at least, I can change how that works. And I hate all the other ones. They confuse the crap out of me, so I just use this one. So that right there is the color panel. It's pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to go through much more. But another thing that you can keep in mind is this area here, which is the hex code. So if I want to remember this color, but then go select another color and draw my happy face, oh, what was that color that I had before? I can just paste, because I copied it, and put it back in there. And that's good in referring between programs. So if I want to take this yellow color, so eyedropper, select that, and I can select this hex code. I can go into Photoshop, open that color selector and paste the hex and get the exact same color for the picture I'm using there. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Next we have swatches. Now here on the swatches panel are the basic swatches. Now you can save swatches. If I go here and I go to, I clicked on the top right, this little panel here. If I select this and go to load default colors, this is the default color swatch panel that Flash gives me. So it's got a whole bunch of swatches, but basically to add a swatch, if I make a new color, which might be a nice rich orange, I can just simply tap in there in swatches and it's added it right there. If you want to see swatches bigger, you can just drag this out and you can see that the swatches become larger. I can select the color, constantly refer to it as much as I want now. The other thing to keep in mind too is when you use shortcut I for eyedropper and select a color or a gradient on an object or on a picture, it instantly and automatically puts them into your swatch palette. So if you don't want that swatch there anymore, you hold Control and click on that swatch and it deletes it. Another thing to keep in mind with these swatches is if I want to make a solid gradient or a radial gradient, I don't always have to select up here to go linear or radial gradient or anything like that. I usually actually select one of the default colors down here and change these and then paste it down there so I have that gradient to constantly refer back to. Cool. So that is the swatches area. Finally, the last thing I want to go through before the end of this tutorial is the properties, publishing settings, sorry, not properties. So if I go File and Publish Settings, if I click that, these are the settings that Flash uses when it publishes your project. This is something that people aren't very familiar with, and when people are new to Flash and try and make a Flash animation, there are a lot of questions that they have as to what's going wrong in their animation that can be fixed purely through the publish settings. So at the moment, as you can see, I have this file to publish in both Flash and a JPEG image format. When it publishes JPEG image, it publishes whatever frame you have selected by default in Flash at that time. So if I published right now, it would publish that frame as a JPEG image. But it's this Flash one that is the most important to me that people get confused about. Now, when I say people get confused, it's mostly through audio settings and sometimes hardware settings. So one thing that you want to make sure that you change, the very default setting of Flash for audio is really, really crap. You want to change it immediately. If you're making a proper animation, you want to change this audio stream and audio event both to at least like 56 to 80 from 16 or whatever it was, like something awful. You don't need to convert stereo to mono. You can if you're making games and things like that. But if it's just like an animation and you don't have much stereo stuff going on, you can just leave it. And fast quality is generally okay. But as a minimum, I would say 64 kbps, quality fast stereo to mono. That'll give you decent enough sound. But if you're doing something much more, higher quality, you want to mess around with that. And then you've got a lot of other settings here, but that's probably the main one people mess around with. If you have images in the Flash, you can change the quality that they render to in the SWF right here. You can change the output file location, the Flash player that it's targeted to, and same with all the other formats. Everything has their own individual settings here. So make sure to keep that in mind whenever you publish your project. I hope that this tutorial has been useful. There's a lot of stuff to keep in mind and remember, but make sure that you practice and just work hard. There are a lot of things that are buried in here that I still haven't learned about, and there are a lot of things that I learned after using Flash for many years that I didn't know even existed. So it's much more about use, it's much more about learning from other people and practice. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Make sure you subscribe, rate, like, comment, blah, blah, blah if you have enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Links are below to download the original files for reference. Remember, if you animate or draw something cool, be sure to share it on Newgrounds.com, the internet's best source for animations, games, art and music. Until next time, see you later.